What's happened now is that folks are looking forward to a rebuild that is estimated in the $500 billion to $1 trillion.
So it's critical minerals, it's infrastructure, it's traditional oil and gas, and it's defense.
You mine the air raid alerts, you go underground, and then you emerge and continue on with your day.
GDP has actually surpassed pre-war levels. If you're just reading the newspapers and the headlines, you're not getting the full picture of what's happening here.
It's not often that in a podcast prep call, my guests talk about their last week, including air raids and being in and out of bomb shelters. But today's guests are all too familiar with that scenario. Today, we're diving into one of the most urgent economic and geopolitical challenges of our time, the reconstruction of Ukraine. And we're going to get a sneak glimpse at the same time into some of the findings of the forthcoming Citi Institute report on what it's going to take to help rebuild a nation after this period of unprecedented change. Estimates suggest that Ukraine faces a decade-long recovery bill of almost $600 billion. This isn't, however, just a government-led rebuild. It's going to involve multiple actors. Private capital, both domestic and international, will be an essential part of this rebuild. The good news is we're already seeing early commitments from international financial institutions, so-called IFIs, and multinational companies, particularly in sectors like energy, natural resources and defence. But scaling that private investment into the infrastructure, social services and broader economic fabric that underpin a durable recovery, well, that's a major challenge, but also a major opportunity. So to unpack all of this, we're joined by two guests who sit not just metaphorically, but physically at the very centre of Ukraine's economic future. Lenna Koszarny, CEO of Horizon Capital, one of the largest private equity investors in Ukraine and a founding partner with decades of experience backing entrepreneurs and building the country's innovation system. Together with Alex McWhorter, Citi Country Officer and Banking Head for Ukraine, who's been long deeply engaged in supporting clients and policymakers through both crisis and reconstruction in the country. Lenna, please, can you tell us a bit about your role? You run not just what was one of the very first PE funds to invest in Ukraine. I think the initial beginnings were back in the $100 million range, but it's also one of the largest today in terms of dollars invested, being on the ground, having backed many unicorns. Presumably one of the things that must have been particularly exciting is that entrepreneurial approach of being invested on the ground. Can you kind of talk about your experience there being on the ground for more than 2, if not 3 decades?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to share this unique Ukraine experience with you. I've been on the ground for 32 years and have been here through truly historic times, through the initial post-independence, through those go-go years in 2000s with the first influx of foreign capital into Ukraine, through revolutions, devaluations, war, full-fledged invasion. It's been truly historic at a time when investors have, in many ways, overlooked Ukraine. But part of the silver lining to what's happened now is that folks are looking forward to a rebuild that is estimated in the $500 billion to $1 trillion that will happen post-war.
It's an incredible space that you occupy. Alex, you've been Citi Country Officer and Banking Head for Citi in Ukraine, I think for more than 6 years. And I guess few will be as well connected as you are, with, of course, the firm having been in the country for more than 25 years, I think I'm saying. Indeed, the only global bank with a long-standing local presence in Ukraine. I think last time we spoke, you were actually in the bomb shelter in Kyiv, which brings home the enormity, of course, of what we're discussing. Could you just talk a bit about your role, your time so far in Ukraine, and how you see the role of the firm?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be on the panel with Lenna, a good colleague and friend. So I've been in the role for almost 8 years now, which is a little crazy when you think about it, but the time is a bit distorted in the current circumstances. We've been here for 28 years now. We serve about 500 corporate clients now on the ground in Ukraine. About 2/3 of those are multinationals that have come to Ukraine, many before the war, but even during the war. And about 1/3 of those are Ukrainian companies. So we provide full service banking, corporate investment banking, anything your clients need. but we work very closely with pretty much every sector across the board, from the traditional sectors like agriculture, minerals, and mining, to the more new sectors in Ukraine, the tech sector, and the very fast-growing military technology sectors here. So it's been a fantastic experience to be here, and we've got a great team, and it's an honor to be part of this, particularly during such a challenging time.
So, Lenna, tell us a bit about Horizon Capital.
Thank you so much. So we're very proud of Horizon Capital. We're proud of what we've achieved. We're proud of the over 2 decades of investing, of backing entrepreneurs in Ukraine and Moldova. And I would say this, that the investor interest, investors who are here on the ground are Ukraine's best investment ambassadors. They are reinvesting, they're investing throughout all of these years. And we see that investors who have not been to Ukraine or have never invested in Ukraine, that they're looking at this as a post-war opportunity. And that's the landscape as we see it.
That's fascinating. Maybe, Alex, turning to you, you've publicly said, I think I'm right in saying, that you're seeing more interest in Ukraine now than at almost any other time in your tenure as the head of Citi's businesses there. What's driving that interest? And I guess where does it come from, both geographically, but also what point of starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of investors in the West just weren't really, Ukraine wasn't on the radar, right? It had sort of didn't have the very public success stories you had out of Poland. It was unclear which path it was headed in terms of Western versus Eastern orientation. And I think people hadn't really appreciated, the level of entrepreneurship and dynamic, workforce that exists in Ukraine today. So I think as people have seen, one, the military ingenuity and the resilience and, the incredible things that the Ukrainian military has achieved. I think, two, they've seen Ukraine firmly pivot and firmly decide on its future orientation, towards the West, as an EU candidate now. And three, I think, people are seeing some of the companies and other things that are coming out of here. I mean, I don't think people realize, but GDP for Ukraine last year was $212 billion. Pre-war, it was $200 billion. So, GDP has actually surpassed pre-war levels. Now, a lot of that is defense spending. A lot of that is donor funding. So, after the 30% decline, that recovery is a bit artificial. But we did a survey with the American Chamber of Commerce in January, back in really one of the most difficult times Ukraine has faced, given the blackouts and given the extremely difficult winter that we've just come through. And in that, 90% of companies were expecting growth this year. 90% of companies are continuing to be fully operate. But the most fascinating statistic in there is 68% of companies are at or above pre-war levels in terms of their financial performance. So the business has continued to operate. It's overcome incredible difficulties in terms of export routes, logistics, and really around the human capital challenges, which is one of the biggest challenges at the moment. But businesses continue to find a way and continue to thrive and continue to invest in itself. And I think investors are starting to see that.
And I guess also it's such an enormous country geographically, which is not obvious to people who've not been there, that they don't always appreciate that when we say Ukraine, there's many different parts of the story that you're both thinking about.
The country's the size of France and Germany put together, right? I mean, it's a massive country, but the impact of the war is felt differently in different parts of the country, and the country's been able to adapt and businesses have been able to take advantage of that. But many businesses continue to operate under extremely difficult conditions, even close to the front line as well.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. Lenna, so you clearly have seen lots of innovation in many different areas of Ukraine over the last decade plus. I guess in terms of the underlying investors in your fund and conversations you have, I guess, with partners across the innovation economy, where geographically do you see that investment most focused, but also, I guess, beyond perhaps the US and Europe? Do you see interest from other countries or other parts of the world in terms of beginning exploring opportunities in Ukraine?
Yeah, in terms of looking at our investors, about half of them are American investors and remainder European, some Asian investors as well. So historically, we have investors with $700 billion in capital, about 40 institutions who have backed our funds. And I believe what they're looking for is they're looking for managers, investment managers, who can go from tough situations through. It's easy that when you don't have challenges, it's easy during years of growth and high deployment, easy fundraising. They're looking for those who can handle whatever comes their way in that 10-year fund cycle. So, we see investor interest from all across the world. The silver lining to the situation in Ukraine, to the war, is that Ukraine is a brand. Ukraine now is a brand of strength, of resilience. It is known worldwide, and the people of Ukraine are known worldwide, and they're seen as people who there's nothing that they can't do. There's nothing that they can't achieve. They're hungry. They're determined. They're resilient. They've gone through the worst situations and come out on the other end. So look, I think all of this bodes very well for Ukraine, not only now as we see with certain investors who are entering, but also post-war. Almost every single other day, every week, we see investors who are coming and building those contacts, building that network, because they understand that after the war is over, there will be a lineup of those who want to start making connections in Ukraine. And that's why it's important to start now. One other point that I want to make is that, this isn't CE in the 90s. This isn't Poland in the 90s or other, Central European countries in the 90s. This is a country that is an EU candidate for accession. In terms of almost every sector, there are local incumbents. There are strong incumbents who are nimble, who are capitalized, who are reinvesting.
Well, that's a great segue, I guess, to you, Alex. And maybe you could just talk about how your role in terms of, financing and supporting, advising innovative Ukrainian businesses, but also thinking about what is the way that these companies are going to integrate into global supply chains, both today, whilst the war continues, but also, as Lenna mentions, post-war as well.
Yeah, we're having conversations all around the world. I've probably been to 15 different countries in the past 12 months, having different meetings there, and done I don't even know how many webinars or client meetings globally around this. And so we see, like Lenna mentioned, some huge interest in coming in here. A lot of people are waiting until the end of the war, but I think there's a real risk that you're too late at that point. In terms of sort of financial instruments and in terms of, how things work here on the ground, one, unlike other conflicts that we've seen in recent decades, Afghanistan, Iraq, or things like that, you have a fully functioning banking system here. Not a single bank, any of the large banks have had any operational issues. All of us have operated every single day, even including the first day of the war. And all of us have continued to operate and continue to lend and continue to work with our clients. So it is a very different situation than other conflicts we've seen, around the world from that sense. That being said, it is challenging for the banking sector to take a lot of the war-related risks. We're not set up for that. We're set to take commercial risks, but war-related risks are difficult. Now, the IFI community, the EBRD, the EIB, the IFC.
And just remind us what IFI is, Alex, because
International Financial Institutions. So these are the multilateral institutions that are operating in Ukraine and are trying to really provide support. They've been here for decades, but they have increased what they've been doing during the war as well. And so we work very closely with a number of them, and they are able to do things some of the commercial banks are not able to do in terms of lending and taking some of these war risks. There's been a slow development around war risk insurance. There are still some gaps in that, but there are programs that are available now that are able to cover some of those risks now as well. So, and the other area I would say is sort of export credit agencies, play an increasing role depending on the country, depending on what's happening there. And there was actually a very important milestone yesterday. The U.S. Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund had their final board meeting, but a board meeting actually approved their first investment. Now, came out of the critical minerals deal that happened over a year ago. And in this is a fund, this a 50-50 JV between U.S. through DFC and through the Ukrainian government, where they will invest in a number of sectors in Ukraine. So it's critical minerals, it's infrastructure, it's traditional oil and gas, and it's defense. And they continue to look at potentially expanding that perimeter. And I think a couple of things people don't realize is, one, they are doing equity, which really is a challenge right now from the IFIs. Most of the IFIs are only really doing debt financing. And two, you don't have to be an American company to be a candidate for this. So this fund is open to any investor or sponsor from a country that has been supportive of Ukraine during the conflict.
It's fascinating. Maybe, Lenna, you could help us think about investments from a scaling perspective, because presumably part of the art and the science is not just to identify great candidates who are on a growth journey, but then to help them scale. And presumably geopolitical and security risk is front and center to many. How do you manage those risks when you deploy your capital? And how do, I guess, your LPs, your limited partners, how do they think about this issue?
Alex, we work on a partnership model. So we have always looked for very strong partners. We back vision entrepreneurs who are leading fast-growing businesses across a variety of sectors. For us, the number one decision that we have to make is selecting our partner. We're a minority investor, we provide growth, and I think that is the main decision that really mitigates many other risks. I want to pick up one of Alex's points too about equity, the importance of equity. And if we look at the size of the investment needs in Ukraine, the World Bank, United Nations, government of Ukraine came up with their rapid needs assessment, their latest report, that estimated 588 billion was the need. And if we drill that down into sectors, everyone has heard about the blackouts. Everyone has heard about the tax on energy sector. It's a 91 billion need for the energy sector. 60% of the power generation has been impacted, has been hit. When you look at transport, over 90 billion. When you look at commerce and industry, over 60 billion. Agriculture, 55. And when you look at the deal makers, the financial intermediaries in the country, then all the funds being raised for Ukraine, it's about 2 to 3 billion. So you can see that when you have equity and you're able to invest that first equity, you really have a very broad subset of opportunities, but you also have all these instruments. You take that first equity, you catalyze additional equity, you mobilize debt, and there's a lot of transactions that are being done now, but also a lot of positioning for the future.
It's fascinating to hear that. And presumably, Alex, in your conversations, policymakers, both locally and internationally, being part of that conversation is essential to understanding kind of how to bring both public and private capital together.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's really important that these institutions, with their role, that they're crowding in private capital, right? And I think, that it requires that partnership. It requires that dialogue. It requires that coordination to make sure that what they are doing is, attractive to investors and is what is going to get the private capital over the line. And I think, that line will shift depending on where we are in the war and things like that. But it's a very close dialogue. We spend a lot of time with the international financial institutions, not just them, but also we engage very heavily with the Ukrainian government and policymakers too, who are, very keen and very engaged on trying to make sure this is a success.
It's fascinating. There's so many sort of strands we could unpick, but maybe, Alex, I could just ask you to dial out a little bit here. And in your experience of, I think you said, is it 7 or 8 years now?
8 years, yeah.
8 years, running Citi's business in this incredible country. Well, what's the kind of key misconception that you think our listeners, both enterprise leaders, but also investors, what's their key misconception they have around doing business in Ukraine that you'd like to kind of take this opportunity to perhaps alter?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there are a lot of misconceptions, and if you're just reading the newspapers and the headlines, you're not getting the full picture of sort of what's happening here. And there's two I'd hone in on. I know you said one, but sorry. The first is life goes on, and the people are resilient. I'm in the center of Kiev now. There's no tanks on the streets. It's a beautiful sunny day. I was at a restaurant last night. Yes, the situation is very difficult. There are power outages. The emotional health of many people, given the stress and many loved ones, fighting or have lost, is tremendous. But, this is not a war-torn country by any means, right? There's a lot of people are still working, they're still getting things done, they're not giving up or fighting, even though they're tired. But it is not a created wasteland for most of the country. I think the second is there's a lot of talk about corruption in Ukraine. And look, there are absolute room for improvement and some real challenges in this space. And there have been some recent headlines that have, really sort of maybe reinforced some of that. But I think what is not always recognized is one of the progress that Ukraine has made on this front here. If you go back to 2014 and you look at Transparency International's corruption rankings, which is the only sort of objective thing that I'm aware of. But Ukraine used to be ranked about 148th out of, I think it was 180 countries in terms of corruption. It has, for 2025, it's down to about 104 out of that same thing. So significant progress on this front. A lot more to do, but it is pretty significant progress. But I also think is when you look at where they are relative to some of the other larger emerging markets, it's a different thing, So it is now ranked better than Mexico, better than Brazil, better than Turkey, and other places where a lot of emerging markets investors have gotten very comfortable with operating. So it's a place where it can be complicated. You need to be careful about who you're engaging with, form good partnerships, but you are able to navigate it. So it is a challenge. There's definite room for improvement, but I do think sometimes the challenges are a bit overstated here.
That's a really striking point you make. And of course, that's the brilliance of being able to put things into context, which of course is what we try to do on this podcast as well. Lenna, maybe I could ask you to kind of pick up that thread as well, particularly with a kind of, a private capital and international investors and underlying potential LPs that you have conversations with.
Thank you. To add to what Alex said, it's really important, the on-the-ground partnership. And those of us who've been here for decades, Alex has been here for almost 10 years, me for over 30, but also the members that we're part of with American Chamber of Commerce. And what we've seen in terms of our over the past 2 decades and looking forward is that's crucial. We've always partnered with our local entrepreneurs, and now with this reconstruction opportunity, we're looking to partner with international strategics and global funds coming in.
It sounds like you really want to encourage, people who are sitting on capital allocation committees around the world to encourage them to send people to come to Kiev, to begin to have some conversations.
Alex, that's a good point, because first thing I tell people, just come. Come to Warsaw, come to Chisinau. You can drive same day to Kiev from Chisinau. You can take the overnight train from Warsaw, and you will be astounded. You will be amazed. Exactly what Alex was talking about. Cafes are open, coffee shops, restaurants, the vibe on the street. Now that the winter is behind us, there's a new spring in everyone's step. It's sunny, it's beautiful. And of course, you mind the air raid alerts, you go underground, and then you emerge and continue on with your day. And that's that's the resilience that we've seen here, which really fundamentally gets people ready for an uncertain world. Who will be better prepared than Ukraine for any challenges that come our way as a global community in the decades to come?
It's a powerful message that you're sharing. Maybe I could just round out by first asking you, Lenna, and then maybe Alex as well. If I understand correctly, about $9 or $10 billion was invested in Ukraine across, I think, sort of 1,400 VC and private equity deals over the last decade or so. How high do you think that can go? And obviously, we've heard some numbers from the World Bank around the needs, but how high do you think that can go?
Alex, you're asking me to look into crystal ball. I mentioned a few figures in terms of 588 billion, which is the most recent assessment. But let's just drill down into the energy sector. Energy sector alone is 91 billion of need. 2/3 is expected to come from the private sector. Over $60 billion just in energy. And looking at energy, I mean, it's heartbreaking to see that 60% of the power generation has been destroyed. At the same time, Ukraine is very well positioned for a diversified energy mix that every country can only dream of. You look at the country has the second largest gas reserves in Europe after Norway. It's got the largest underground gas storage in Europe. It's very well positioned to be a supplier, to develop its own gas and to supply to Europe post-war. So that's just one aspect. But you see that over and over in terms of the renewables, and renewables are continuing to be built, are about 20% of Ukraine's energy mix and expected to grow. So there's enormous opportunities, gas to power, battery storage. You know, we've seen this whole model of gas powering data centers that we've seen throughout the world, and especially in the US. Ukraine can play in that sector in the future with the gas reserves it has, developing those reserves and then powering data centers and powering AI. Ukraine can be a leader in Europe in that field. So really, I would say the sky's the limit. Obviously, Ukraine is looking at to grow its GDP in the way that it wants to. It wants to attract 10 billion a year after the war is over.
It's fascinating, and you set the scene so well, and I don't think I'd fully appreciated even just that sort of that pool of energy. And every country's obviously thinking about its energy mix in the AI era and the connected kind of supply chain era as well. Alex, what's your take there?
Yeah, look, I think, from an investment thing, I think we haven't seen a lot of the global investors here ever. And, I would expect that once they do a deal and they get comfortable with it, they get comfortable with the country and the partnerships and stuff like this, I think they will, come in significant amounts over time. It'll take some time, they'll test it out. There'll be some pilots here. Again, a lot of people are potentially waiting till the end of the conflict or when that's in sight.
Well, look, there's so much more we could and hopefully will talk about. And obviously our Citi Institute report on this topic is going to be coming out shortly. So I'd encourage people to look for that. But really, what I'd like to say more than anything, it's a privilege to have you both, Alex and Lenna, from Kiev live for this episode. And I'm sure many of those listening to this will echo my sentiments when I say how much we deeply admire what you and your teams are all doing on the ground there in Ukraine. So thank you both very much for joining, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much.
There's so much to highlight in the conversation we've just heard, but things that really stood out to me. One, Ukraine is a brand of strength and resilience, Lenna told us, known worldwide, as are the people of Ukraine. That was a powerful message, I think. Secondly, we heard from both Alex and Lenna about the importance of partnership with investors, partnership with entrepreneurs, partnership with public and private capital, and the benefit and importance of that being on the ground. And then finally, what stood out for me was the line that Lenna said, which is, this is going to be the biggest reconstruction since the Second World War, and there's going to be huge opportunities. And understanding that as a new, potentially EU joining country that is Ukraine emerges, well, that's going to be tremendous. So for more on this topic, do look out for the Citi Institute report on this exact topic, and we look forward to engaging with you going forward.
Citigroup, Citi and Horizon Capital are not affiliated and are independent of each other. Horizon Capital maintains a client relationship with Citi through Citi Investment Banking. The speakers' views are their own and may not necessarily reflect the views of Citi or any of its affiliates. All opinions are subject to change without notice. Neither the information provided nor any opinion expressed constitutes a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. The expressions of opinion are not intended to be a forecast of future events or a guarantee of future results.